Hey everyone, welcome to another macro photography video. So today I want to talk to you about settings in macro photography, and in particular settings when you're using a flash and diffuser setup like this to shoot macro photos. And I'm going to show you and help you understand all of the different settings that you have at your disposal to get a good image in macro, and really help you understand these settings and be able to use these settings consciously to get a good image in any situation. Alright, so to start with the basics, let me just explain the four main settings that affect the exposure and look of your image and how they work in particular when using flash. And first of all, let me start with the one that actually has the biggest effect on the look of your image, which is the aperture. Now, of course, the aperture has an effect on the exposure as well. If you use a smaller aperture number, which is a wider opening, that will give you a brighter exposure. And if you use a larger aperture number, a higher number, which is a smaller opening, less light comes through to the sensor, which means that you have a darker image. But the thing that we're more interested in for macro photography is the fact that aperture actually affects the depth of field, which is the area that's in focus in your image. So a small aperture number, so a big opening like f2.8, will have a very thin slice of your image in focus, which means a very narrow depth of field, which means that you also have quite a soft, blurry background, but only a very narrow slice is in focus. And this is especially accentuated in macro photography. The higher magnification you go, the less is in focus at any given aperture than it would be when you're shooting stuff further away. Whereas if you shoot at a higher aperture number, which means a smaller opening, that means that you have more depth of field, you have more in focus, and just a larger area of your subject, a larger area of your image is sharp. So you might think, and this is quite a common kind of mistake to make early on in macro photography, is just use the highest aperture number that you have. Go to like f16, f22, the highest you can go on your lens to get as much as possible in focus. And this makes sense at first, but there's a problem with that, which is diffraction. Diffraction is a physical property of shooting at high magnifications and quite technical, but just to give a general overview, basically when you're shooting at higher apertures, and especially at high magnifications, the image becomes a little bit soft. It's just not quite as sharp. And when you're shooting, say, at 1:1 magnification, then something like f16 or f22 often will be quite soft. You won't have as much detail. So when you're using the aperture, you want to find a balance somewhere in between the optimal sharpest aperture of your lens, which tends to be something like f5.6 or f8, and somewhere where you have more in focus. So somewhere in between there, and this is also dependent on the sensor size. So on a smaller sensor like Micro Four Thirds, the same aperture, say f5.6, will be a higher effective aperture. There's more depth of field and less light than f5.6 on a full frame sensor. So you have to kind of take all of these things into consideration and find the right balance between sharpness and depth of field when you're using aperture in macro photography. The next thing you have to work with is the flash power. And the flash power basically just affects how much light is coming out of the flash, which means how bright the image is, or not necessarily how much light, but actually how long the burst from the flash is. So the maximum flash power, which is shown in 1/1 is the most, and that is the longest, which means that light is shown on your subject for the longest amount of time. And this is still very slow, but at the highest flash powers, you might not quite be able to freeze action quite as much. Whereas a lower flash power, something like 1/16, 1/32, even 1/64, is a much, much, much shorter duration of the flash, which just means that the light is on your subject for a shorter amount of time, which means that the exposure is a little bit darker. There's not quite as much light. And the flash power, of course, mostly just affects whatever is close to you, so your subject, because that's just what the flash hits, what the diffuser hits in this case. Anything past about this point probably won't be hit by light from the flash very much. So you can use the flash power to adjust the exposure of your foreground without having too much effect on the background. Of course, this is only important if your background is quite far away from your subject, but if I have something on a branch here and the background is the forest far away, then of course the flash power will only affect the subject on the branch. The other thing to take into consideration with flash power is that higher flash powers means that your flash has a much longer recharge time, a much longer recycle time, which means that it takes much longer until the flash can fire again. And often at 1/1 or 1/2 or even 1/4 power, the recharge time will be very long. You have to wait 1 or 2, even 3 or 4 seconds before you can fire another shot. And sometimes this doesn't matter that much, but if you have to have fast recycle times, if you want to shoot fast bursts or something like that, and we'll get more into this later in the video, but if you want to shoot fast bursts, you have to take into consideration that you have to use a flash power where the flash can actually keep up and fire. Say you're shooting at 10 frames per second, you have to make sure that the flash can recycle in faster than 1/10 of a second so that it can actually keep up with fast shooting. All right, so next up we've got the shutter speed. And of course the shutter speed is just the amount of time that your shutter is open, letting light get onto the sensor of your camera. And interestingly, the shutter speed doesn't really have much effect on the exposure, at least of your subject, of whatever's close to your lens when you're shooting macro with flash, because the flash is so much brighter than any ambient light reaching your subject that even if you use quite a slow shutter speed, the flash, which is a very, very short duration, will expose the subject for that duration and basically freeze the action in the time that the flash is actually firing, so that even if you use a slower shutter speed, the shutter speed won't really have much effect on the exposure. And this means that the shutter speed you use doesn't matter that much, but most of the time I would recommend just using the maximum sync shutter speed with your flash of your camera. And usually it's a little bit different on different cameras. Usually this will be either 1/160th of a second, 1/200th of a second, sometimes 1/250th of a second. You just have to figure out what this is for your camera. But most of the time you can just leave the shutter speed there at that point and not really think about it. But there's a few situations where having control of the shutter speed can be beneficial to getting a better image. And this is because if you have a background further away, like I mentioned, the flash power and the flash only really exposes your foreground, which means that often the background will be quite dark. But if you use a slower shutter speed, you can use the shutter speed to only expose for the background, not affecting the foreground, to get more light into the background. And if you have a background that's very far away, if you have like the forest far behind, that'll normally be quite dark. So you could use a slower shutter speed, so something like 1/50th or 1/30th of a second, to get more light onto the background while not really changing the exposure of the subject, and use that to get a little bit more color, to get a bit more light and a bit of a brighter, more colorful background than if you just use the maximum sync shutter speed. And you just have to experiment with which shutter speed really works best and gives the nicest effect. But this is a good thing to keep in mind if your background is quite far away and quite far behind your subject. So the last setting that we have to work with to change the exposure in macro photography is, of course, the ISO. And the ISO is just the sensitivity of your sensor, which just means that your image is either brighter at a higher ISO, so a higher sensitivity, or darker at a lower ISO and a lower sensitivity. And the problem is with shooting high ISOs, the higher ISO you go, the more noise comes into the image, the grainier the image is, and you often lose a little bit of detail the higher ISO you go. So most of the time, the nice thing with macro photography, when you're using a flash, is that you've got flash power that you can just raise high enough up to compensate for shooting even at low ISOs, which means that you can mostly just shoot at base ISO, at the lowest ISO you have on your camera, which is usually either ISO 100 on a full frame camera, or I think 160 or on most APS-C cameras, and 200 on Micro Four Thirds. And you can mostly just shoot at this base ISO, which will give you the best image quality and the least noise, and raise your flash power to compensate for that, just to get the exposure that you want. Like I mentioned though, the problem with shooting at really high flash powers is that you have slower recharge times. So if you're shooting in a way that you need to shoot bursts, sometimes you'll want to keep your flash power low and raise your ISO and have that as a bit of a compromise to brighten up your image, which means that you can use a lower flash power or a higher aperture and just use the ISO as a bit of a compromise to get slightly more grain, but be able to use the other settings how you want to. All right, so now that you kind of know how all of these settings work, I wanted to talk a little bit about my sort of thought process when I'm setting up my settings for a shot, and yeah, just how I go about setting up my settings when I'm out in the field shooting. For this first section, I'm just talking about single shots. And first of all, when you're shooting single shots, you don't really need to think about the ISO very much. You can just keep it at base ISO. That's it. You want the best image quality you can. And like I mentioned, you don't really need fast recharge times on your flash for single shots, which means that you can use the lowest ISO and compensate for exposure with the flash power. And next up, after the ISO, you can just keeping that at base ISO, you can look at the aperture. And this takes kind of just a bit of trial and error, seeing what looks best. And this is just, like I mentioned before, again, this balance between the optimal sharpness and the best depth of field. And for single shots, I tend to err more towards getting a little bit more depth of field and losing a little bit of sharpness, just because I find when I'm shooting single shots, I'm mostly going more for having a nice composition. But of course, you don't want to go too far with the aperture and have your image be completely soft. So experiment a little bit, find what a good balance is for you. Now, once you've got your ISO and aperture set, you can set the flash power. And again, this is sometimes a little bit of trial and error, just to see what gives the perfect exposure. You could actually, for single shots, also shoot your flash in TTL mode, which means that it fires a test shot and your camera tells the flash what exposure it should set. But generally, I don't really like shooting in TTL mode because it means you have so much variation between shots, and generally I like to match up the exposure of my shots. So I will usually shoot in manual mode and just adjust the settings to get those right. And finally, you want to think about, is this a situation where the shutter speed actually really matters at all? If I have my subject here and the background is right here, the flash will illuminate all of that anyway, and the shutter speed has no effect. But if I have my subject here and the background is really far away and is like a brightly lit field or something, then I might open up the shutter speed a little bit or use a slower shutter speed and use that to change the settings. And usually I kind of set up my settings once at the beginning and just leave them set somewhere around base ISO, find the optimal flash power, and then just make slight adjustments from there when I'm shooting different scenes to get it right. At lower magnifications, you tend to have more light, so you maybe have to use a smaller aperture or lower flash power. When you go to really high magnifications, you might have to use a higher flash power to compensate. So it's a lot of just getting it set up once, fiddling around with it a little bit for each shot. Really don't worry about taking a bunch of test shots to make sure it get the settings just right. And yeah, that's sort of a good process for thinking through all of your settings. All right, now that I've kind of explained my overall process, let me just show a few examples and talk through why I'm making the decisions I am on the settings as I shoot each of these photos. So first of all, I've got a little cuckoo wasp on these really pretty little kind of lavender purple colored flowers. And of course, I'm just shooting single shots, so I can stay at base ISO. That's fine, which is in this case on my camera is ISO 125. And the aperture, so I'm shooting single shots, I want to strike kind of a balance between sharpness and depth of field. And on my lens and camera, the best balance for this magnification is around f8. So I'm going to shoot at f8. I think the flash power that should work is somewhere around 1/8 power. Let me just take a test shot of one of the other flowers just to see if that looks good. And on that test shot, I also quite like the dark background. So I'm going to keep the shutter speed at 1/200th of a second. And let me just take a few test shots or a few photos of the wasp at those settings and show you what it looks like. So for one more example, I've got this pair of Cryptocephalus leaf beetles. And first of all, I'm just going to shoot them with the same settings as before at ISO 125, f8, I think 1/200th of a second, and 1/8 flash power. You can see that gives a very dark background, which I think in this context doesn't look very nice, especially because the beetles are very dark, which means there's not that much contrast between the beetles themselves and the background. So to change that, I'm going to use a technique I mentioned before, which is I'm going to use a much slower shutter speed of around 1/30th of a second in this case. And that way, like I mentioned, I've got a much brighter exposure in the background. In this case, the background is kind of a lighter area of grass, and that gives a much nicer effect. Okay, so those were a few examples for how I use settings for single shots, but a lot of the time when I'm doing macro photos, I shoot focus stacks. And there's a few key differences in how you have to set up the settings for focus stacks. First of all, the aperture. You still have to strike this balance between optimum sharpness and depth of field, but for focus stacking, I tend to go more towards getting better sharpness because the depth of field doesn't matter that much. I'm already stacking to get optimum depth of field. So usually on my setup, I'll shoot stacks somewhere around f5.6, which just gives me a bit better sharpness while still having usable depth of field for the focus stacks. And the other difference is that you need the flash to have quite a fast recycle time, at least most of the time. At least either you're shooting in burst mode, like I do, or focus bracketing. And either way, you'll need your flash to be able to keep up with whatever burst rate you're shooting at. So in my case, it's 10 frames per second, and I need to have my flash be able to keep up at 10 frames per second. So rather than setting the ISO first and adjusting the flash power based on the ISO, I'll usually get the highest flash power I can that can still keep up at 10 frames per second. In my case, that's around 1/16 or 1/32, and then adjust the ISO based on that. So for focus stacks, I tend to have my ISO a little bit over base ISO just to be able to balance out and have a reasonable flash power that can keep up with fast bursts for extended periods of time. And of course, the shutter speed, again, same as with single shots, either just keep it at the maximum flash sync speed, or in certain situations, it can be a nice effect to have more light in the background. That doesn't change between single shots and stacks. So I've shown lots of examples for focus stacking in my previous videos, and I always show the settings with each picture when I show it, but I thought I would show one more example here, and I found a whole bunch of crickets of some sort around this little patch of forest floor, and there's one of them here on the log. So I'm going to try and get a quick stack of them, of this one, and I'm shooting at around 1:1 magnification and f5.6 because, like I said before, that's around the optimum balance where the sharpness is very, very good, which is what I want for focus stacking. My shutter speed is 1/200th because that's just the maximum flash sync speed, and my flash power, the fastest roughly that I can keep up at 10 frames per second burst mode, which is what I'm shooting, I've got my flash power at around 1/32 power. And the ISO that I need to use to balance that out is ISO 250, so a little bit over base ISO, but still very, very usable quality. So I'm just gonna frame up for a quick stack and then shoot that like this. So I would say just keep practicing with those settings a lot, and just practice being very conscious with how you shoot and which settings you're using, and eventually these kind of become second nature. The more you shoot and the more you really think about them, you don't really eventually think about each individual setting like balancing the ISO and flash power quite as much. It all becomes kind of subconscious, and that allows you to think a lot more about the more creative aspects of macro photography. So yeah, I hope that this video has helped give a bit of an overview of all of these important settings for shooting macro with a flash. And let me know in the comments if you have any more questions. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.